Oh my God. I can't believe this.
11:58 p.m. 2 minutes until execution. The condemned billionaire makes one final request: I want to see my dog. They think he's stalling for time. They're wrong. Because Luna knows what the FBI doesn't, and what she's about to expose will flip this case inside out. This isn't about saying goodbye. This is about preventing the execution of an innocent man. 3 minutes and 27 seconds. The warden's voice cut through the sterile air of Pennsylvania State Penitentiary's execution chamber like a blade. Alexander Rothschild, once worth $42 billion, now worth exactly nothing, lay strapped to the gurney, his wrists burning against the leather restraints. The 4-needle in his arm felt ice-cold, a stark reminder that death was literally flowing through his veins, waiting for the final command. Any last words, Mr. Rothschild? Alexander's steel-gray eyes, the same ones that had stared down corporate boards and crushed competitors without blinking, now glistened with something no one in this room had ever seen from him: vulnerability. I want to see my dog. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Behind the glass partition, 43 witnesses, victims' families, reporters, government officials, leaned forward. The executioner's finger hovered over the button. Warden Patricia Mills, a woman who'd overseen 62 executions in her 20-year career, had heard every conceivable last request. But this? This was new. Sir, that's not standard protocol. 2 minutes and 58 seconds. The technician's monotone update sent a ripple of tension through the chamber. Alexander turned his head as far as the restraints would allow, his voice cracking like ice under pressure. Her name is Luna. She's 4 years old, golden retriever. She's been waiting for me at Riverside Pet Sanctuary in Chester County for 18 months. His breath came in short gasps. Please. I know I don't deserve anything, but she never stopped believing I'd come back. What do you think drives a man to his final moments, pride or love? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The witnesses behind the glass began murmuring. Sarah Chen, the lead prosecutor who'd spent 3 years building the case against Rothschild for embezzling pension funds from 60,000 workers, felt something unexpected twist in her chest. She'd seen this man destroy lives without remorse, watched him smirk through testimonies of elderly people losing their life savings. But now, Warden Mills, Alexander's voice was barely a whisper, I've never begged for anything in my life. But I'm begging you now. 2 minutes. That's all I need. The clock on the wall showed 11:58 p.m. Execution time, midnight. Dr. James Hoffman, the prison psychiatrist who'd evaluated Alexander weekly for 6 months, stepped forward. Warden, psychological evaluation suggests that denying this request could cause unnecessary psychological distress in his final moments. The Eighth Amendment, don't quote law at me, Dr. Mills' jaw tightened. She'd followed protocol to the letter for 2 decades. Never deviated. Never bent the rules. But something in Alexander's eyes, a desperation so raw it seemed to reach through his usual armor of arrogance, made her hesitate. Behind the glass, Elizabeth Harper, whose grandfather had lost his entire retirement to Alexander's schemes, stood up abruptly. Let him suffer, she called out, her voice muffled but audible. Like Grandpa suffered when he couldn't afford his heart medication. But her sister, Margaret, grabbed her arm. Lizzie, look at him. Really look at him. Alexander Rothschild, the man Fortune magazine had called the Ice King of corporate America, was crying. Not the calculated tears of a manipulator, but the broken sobs of a man facing the abyss. 1 minute and 43 seconds. The warden's radio crackled to life. Mills here. Warden, this is Captain Rodriguez at the sanctuary. We have a situation. The dog, Luna, she's been howling for the past hour. Non-stop. Like she knows something's wrong. And there's something else. Alexander's eyes widened. Even from 18 months of separation, she still felt it. The connection that had been the only pure thing in his corrupted life. Warden, please. His voice broke completely. She saved my life once. Let me say goodbye. Mills looked at the clock, 11 hours 58 minutes and 47 seconds. 13 seconds to make a decision that would either maintain 2 decades of perfect protocol or stop the procedure, she commanded. The room erupted. Witnesses shouted. The executioner's hand froze. The technician looked up in confusion. "Ma'am, we don't have authorization to. I'm giving the authorization. Get me the governor on the line. Now." Mills turned to Alexander, her voice stern but not unkind. "You get 5 minutes with your dog, Rothschild. 5 minutes. Then we finish this." But as Captain Rodriguez burst through the chamber doors 30 seconds later, a golden retriever in his arms and an expression of shock on his face, nobody in that room could have predicted what was about to unfold. Luna's eyes locked onto Alexander's the moment she entered the chamber, and her howl, a sound so full of pure, unconditional love that it seemed to crack the very foundations of justice, changed everything. Because sometimes, love doesn't just heal. Sometimes, it reveals the truth. Luna's paws scrambled against Captain Rodriguez's chest as she fought to reach Alexander, her golden fur catching the harsh fluorescent light like captured sunlight. The moment she saw him, strapped down, pale, vulnerable, her entire body began trembling with a desperate energy that seemed to fill the sterile execution chamber with something it had never contained before. Pure, unfiltered love. "Easy, girl, easy," Rodriguez whispered, but his own hands were shaking as he approached the gurney. He'd been working with animals for 15 years, had seen dogs reunite with owners after deployments, after hospital stays, after natural disasters, but he'd never seen anything like this. Luna wasn't just excited, she was frantic with a kind of recognition that seemed to transcend the physical world. Her amber eyes, usually calm and gentle according to the sanctuary records, now blazed with an intensity that made several witnesses step back from the glass. As Rodriguez carefully lowered her toward Alexander's restrained form, Luna immediately pressed her nose against his neck, breathing in his scent with deep, shuddering inhales that seemed to catalog every moment of their separation. Alexander's tears came harder now, streaming down his face as he whispered, "Luna, my sweet girl, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I left you." The dog's response was immediate and devastating. She began licking his tears away with the same gentle precision she'd used when he'd had nightmares, when panic attacks had left him gasping on his penthouse floor, when the weight of his empire had threatened to crush the last fragments of his humanity. The witnesses behind the glass had fallen completely silent, transfixed by the scene unfolding before them. Sarah Chin found herself gripping the metal rail so tightly her knuckles had gone white, her prosecutorial mind struggling to reconcile the monster she'd built her case against with the broken man whispering endearments to a dog who clearly adored him. Elizabeth Harper, who had demanded his suffering just moments before, felt her anger wavering as she watched Luna's tail wagging so hard her entire body wiggled with joy despite the somber surroundings. "This doesn't change anything," Elizabeth whispered to her sister Margaret, but her voice lacked conviction. Margaret, a veterinarian herself, was studying the interaction with professional interest that was rapidly becoming personal fascination. "Lizzie, look at how she's responding to him. Dogs don't fake this kind of bond. This kind of attachment, it takes years to develop, and it only happens when someone has been genuinely kind to them." Dr. Hoffman stepped closer to the gurney, his clinical mind racing as he observed the profound psychological shift in Alexander's demeanor. The man who had sat in his office for months, cold and calculating even when discussing his impending death, had transformed completely. His breathing had steadied, his muscle tension had decreased, and for the first time since his incarceration, he looked peaceful. "Warden," Dr. Hoffman said quietly, "I need to note for the record that the prisoner's psychological state has altered dramatically. This level of calm, it's unprecedented in my experience with death row inmates." Captain Rodriguez had been expecting a simple, heartbreaking goodbye, 5 minutes of a condemned man saying farewell to his pet before facing his fate. What he hadn't expected was Luna's behavior to become increasingly agitated the longer she remained in the chamber. While she was clearly overjoyed to see Alexander, something else was driving her actions. She kept lifting her head from his chest, ears pricked forward, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then she would return to Alexander, pawing gently at his restraints with a whine that sounded almost urgent. "She's trying to tell us something," Rodriguez murmured, his years of animal behavior training kicking in. He'd seen this before, dogs who detected seizures before they happened, who alerted their owners to gas leaks, who somehow knew things that humans missed. Luna suddenly sat up straight on Alexander's chest, threw back her head, and released a howl that sent chills down every spine in the room. It wasn't the mournful cry of a dog saying goodbye, it was the sharp, insistent call of an animal trying to save someone. Alexander's eyes widened in recognition. "She did this before," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder and growing realization. 18 months ago, the night before my arrest. She wouldn't stop howling, wouldn't let me sleep. I thought she was just anxious about the FBI raids, but..." His voice trailed off as memory crashed over him like a wave. "Oh my God. Oh my God," she knew. She was trying to warn me. Luna's howling intensified, and she began pawing more frantically at Alexander's restraints, her behavior becoming so distressed that even the hardened corrections officers shifted uncomfortably. The transformation in the witness gallery was palpable as Luna's distress seemed to awaken something in the people who had come to watch Alexander Rothschild die. Margaret Harper found herself analyzing the dog's behavior with her veterinary training, noting the specific pitch of the howls, the way Luna's ears kept swiveling toward the chamber's ventilation system, the almost frantic quality of her movements that spoke of urgent warning rather than simple grief. "Warden Mills," Margaret called out suddenly, her voice cutting through Luna's cries, "I'm a veterinarian, and that dog isn't saying goodbye. She's alerting to something." Dogs have that same posture, that same vocalization pattern when they detect medical emergencies, seizures, diabetic episodes, even carbon monoxide leaks. Sarah Chin felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She'd spent 3 years studying every aspect of Alexander Rothschild's life, building a case that painted him as a calculating sociopath who destroyed thousands of lives without remorse. But dogs didn't love sociopaths. Dogs didn't risk their own safety to warn sociopaths. Dogs didn't maintain 18 months of loyalty to people who were genuinely evil. "What if we got it wrong?" she whispered to herself, the words feeling like betrayal even as they left her lips. Behind her, James Morrison, whose mother had lost her home due to Alexander's pension fund scheme, was staring at the scene with growing confusion. "My mom always said you could judge a person by how animals treat them," he said quietly to no one in particular. "She said animals see souls, not bank accounts." Dr. Hoffman was frantically taking notes, his mind racing through 18 months of psychological evaluations, looking for clues he might have missed. Alexander had never once mentioned Luna during their sessions, had maintained the cold, corporate facade even when discussing his childhood, his fears, his regrets. But now, watching him with the dog, Hoffman was seeing layers of humanity that had been completely hidden, as if Luna's presence had unlocked parts of Alexander's personality that prison had buried. The clock on the wall now read 12:03 a.m., 3 minutes past the scheduled execution time, and Warden Mills found herself in completely uncharted territory. Luna's behavior was becoming more frantic by the second, her howls now accompanied by sharp barks directed at the chamber's ventilation grates. Captain Rodriguez, still holding the trembling dog, noticed she kept looking up at the ceiling, her nose twitching as if she'd caught a scent that alarmed her. "Warden," he said urgently, "I've seen this before. Drug detection dogs, bomb detection dogs, they all exhibit this same behavior pattern when they've identified a threat. Whatever she's alerting to, it's not emotional. It's environmental." Alexander, his mind clearer than it had been in months thanks to Luna's calming presence, began to piece together fragments of memory that had seemed unimportant before. "The ventilation system," he said suddenly, his voice gaining strength. "Luna always had respiratory issues when she was young. She's hypersensitive to air quality. The night she was howling before my arrest, I found a crack in my penthouse's HVAC system the next morning. Carbon monoxide leak. If she hadn't kept me awake. He looked up at the ceiling vents, then at Warden Mills with growing urgency. Check the air quality in this chamber. Please. She's not trying to save just me, she's trying to save everyone. The words hung in the air like a revelation, and suddenly the witness gallery was buzzing with concerned murmurs. Elizabeth Harper found herself thinking about her grandfather, how he'd always trusted animals more than people, how he'd taught her that creatures who couldn't lie were often the most honest judges of character. What if the howling isn't about grief, she said aloud, her previous anger now replaced by growing concern. What if it's about danger? Luna, as if sensing the shift in the room's energy, increased her warning calls, her entire body rigid with the effort to communicate something desperately important to the humans who seemed so slow to understand. And in that moment, as dawn began to break over Pennsylvania and Luna's cries echoed through the execution chamber like a clarion call for truth, everyone present began to realize they weren't just witnessing a man's final moments with his beloved pet, they were witnessing the beginning of something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about justice, truth, and the power of unconditional love to reveal what humans had missed. The piercing wail of the facility's emergency alarm system suddenly joined Luna's desperate howls, creating a cacophony that sent every person in the execution chamber into high alert. Warden Mills' radio erupted with frantic voices, "Code Yellow! Code Yellow! Environmental hazard detected in Block 7. The voice of Chief Engineer Marcus Thompson crackled through the static, his usual calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. Warden, we've got a massive nitrogen oxide leak in the ventilation system feeding the execution chamber. Levels are approaching critical, everyone needs to evacuate immediately." The words hit the room like a physical blow, and suddenly Luna's frantic behavior made horrifying sense. She hadn't been saying goodbye to Alexander, she'd been trying to save 47 lives from a silent killer that would have rendered them all unconscious before anyone realized the danger. Dr. Hoffman's medical training kicked in as he shouted over the alarms, "Nitrogen oxide displacement, we'd have all passed out within minutes. No one would have known what hit us." Alexander, still strapped to the gurney, felt a surge of pride and love for Luna that nearly overwhelmed him. "Good girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "My brave, beautiful girl. You saved us all." Luna, sensing the change in the humans around her, finally stopped her warning howls and pressed her face against Alexander's cheek, her tail wagging with the satisfaction of a job well done. But as corrections officers rushed to begin evacuation procedures, Captain Rodriguez noticed something that made his blood run cold. Luna's breathing was becoming labored, and her usually bright eyes were beginning to dim. The 4-year-old golden retriever had been exposed to the toxic gas longer than anyone, her smaller body and respiratory sensitivity making her the first victim of the very danger she'd worked so desperately to prevent. The evacuation of the execution chamber became a scene of controlled chaos as 47 people, witnesses, officials, media, and families, were rushed through emergency protocols that had never been tested under these circumstances. Sarah Chen found herself helping elderly witnesses navigate the sudden darkness as emergency lighting kicked in, her prosecutor's mind reeling with implications that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. If Luna had detected this environmental threat, if her bond with Alexander had been strong enough to compel her to save a room full of strangers including those who'd come to watch him die, what did that say about the man she'd spent 3 years painting as a monster? "Move, move, move," corrections officers shouted as they guided people toward emergency exits, but Elizabeth Harper couldn't take her eyes off the scene unfolding on the gurney. Alexander, still restrained and unable to move, was watching Luna's distress with the kind of anguish she'd never seen on a human face, raw, unfiltered terror not for his own life, but for hers. "Please," he was begging Captain Rodriguez, "please get her to a vet. The nitrogen oxide, her respiratory system, she needs oxygen, she needs treatment. I don't care what happens to me, just save her." Margaret Harper, her veterinary instincts overriding everything else, broke from the evacuation line and rushed toward the gurney. "I'm a vet," she called to the corrections officers trying to stop her. The dog needs immediate intervention. As she reached Luna, her trained hands immediately began assessing the golden retriever's condition: rapid shallow breathing, pale gums, the telltale signs of toxic gas inhalation. "We need to get her outside now," Margaret said urgently. "Fresh air, oxygen if we have it. Captain Rodriguez, help me carry her." But Luna, even in her weakened state, refused to leave Alexander's side, whimpering and struggling weakly against Margaret's attempts to lift her away from the man she'd just saved. In the chaos of the evacuation, something extraordinary began to happen that would later be called miraculous by those who witnessed it. As Margaret worked to stabilize Luna's breathing with emergency first aid techniques, Elizabeth Harper found herself inexplicably drawn to help, her anger toward Alexander crumbling in the face of his obvious genuine love for the dog and Luna's deteriorating condition. "What can I do?" Elizabeth asked Margaret, her voice stripped of the hatred that had brought her here tonight. "Hold her head steady while I check her airways," Margaret replied, and suddenly the two sisters who had come to watch a man die were working together to save the life of his beloved companion. Alexander, watching this scene unfold through his own tears, whispered words that cut through the chaos like a blade: "Please don't let her die because of me. She's the only good thing I ever did right in my life." The words carried such raw honesty that even the corrections officers paused in their duties, and Dr. Hoffman, who was assisting with Luna's care, found himself studying Alexander with new eyes. This wasn't the cold, calculating criminal he'd been evaluating for months. This was a man whose entire world had just narrowed to the breathing of a golden retriever, whose own imminent death had become secondary to her survival. Sarah Chen, coordinating the witness evacuation, overheard a conversation between two FBI agents that made her freeze in her tracks. "The nitrogen oxide leak, it's been building for weeks according to the engineering report. If the execution had proceeded as scheduled, we'd have 47 dead bodies and no idea why." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Luna hadn't just detected a random malfunction, she detected a systemic failure that would have been blamed on Alexander's execution, covering up a maintenance negligence that could have been prosecuted as criminal endangerment. As the evacuation continued and Luna fought for each breath in Margaret's capable hands, the most powerful moment of the night unfolded in a way that no one could have anticipated. Alexander, his restraints finally removed by corrections officers preparing to move him to a safe location, used his first moment of freedom in 18 months not to flee or fight, but to gently place his hand on Luna's trembling head. "I'm here, baby girl," he whispered, and at the sound of his voice, Luna's labored breathing began to steady, her eyes focusing on his face with an intensity that seemed to draw strength from their connection. The witnesses who remained, those who had insisted on staying to ensure Luna received help, watched in stunned silence as the dog who had saved them all seemed to find the will to live in the presence of the man they'd come to see executed. Margaret Harper, her hands still monitoring Luna's vital signs, found herself whispering, "She's stabilizing. Her breathing is improving. It's like his presence is actually healing her." Elizabeth, tears streaming down her face as she held Luna's paw, looked up at Alexander with an expression that contained no trace of the hatred she'd carried for 18 months. "She really loves you," she said simply. "Animals don't lie about love." Alexander's response came in a voice so broken with gratitude that it seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "She saved my life long before tonight. I was dying inside, killed by my own greed and ambition, and she taught me what it meant to love something more than myself. I became a better man because of her, but by then it was too late to undo the damage I'd done." Dr. Hoffman, documenting everything for what he now realized would be a psychological evaluation that challenged every assumption about redemption and character, found himself asking a question that would change the trajectory of everything. "Alexander, if Luna could save 47 lives tonight, what else might she know that we've missed?" The golden retriever, now breathing more steadily but still weak from her exposure to the toxic gas, seemed to understand that she had become the center of something much larger than a simple goodbye between a man and his pet. As the all-clear signal finally came and the immediate danger passed, Luna lifted her head with tremendous effort and looked directly at Sarah Chen, the prosecutor who had built the case against Alexander. Her amber eyes, still clouded from the gas exposure, seemed to hold a depth of intelligence that made Sarah step closer despite herself. Luna then turned toward the execution chamber's evidence locker, a secured area where personal effects of condemned prisoners were stored, and released a soft whine that was different from her earlier warning calls. This sound was inquiring, almost questioning, as if she were asking permission to show them something. Captain Rodriguez, who had worked with detection dogs for years, immediately recognized the behavior. "She's indicating something," he said urgently. "That's a trained search pattern. She's not just a pet, she's been trained for detection work." Alexander's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The night before my arrest," he said, his voice gaining strength as the pieces fell into place, "Luna kept trying to lead me to my home office. She kept pawing at my desk, at the filing cabinets. I thought she was just anxious about all the FBI activity, but..." He looked around at the assembled group: prosecutors, victims' families, medical professionals, law enforcement, all of whom had their eyes fixed on him with growing realization. What if she was trying to show me evidence? What if she knew something about my case that even I didn't know? Luna, as if responding to his words, struggled to her feet despite Margaret's gentle attempts to keep her resting, and took 2 shaky steps toward the evidence locker before looking back at the humans expectantly. The implications hung in the air like electricity, and Warden Mills found herself making another unprecedented decision in a night full of them. "Get me the evidence key," she said quietly. "If this dog saved 47 lives tonight by detecting a danger we missed, maybe she's trying to save one more life by showing us a truth we've overlooked." And as Luna's tail gave one weak but determined wag, everyone in that room realized they were about to witness something that would either confirm Alexander Rothschild's guilt beyond any doubt, or prove that justice had been about to claim an innocent man. The evidence locker's steel door swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to echo the collective tension in the room, revealing Alexander Rothschild's personal effects arranged on sterile metal shelves like artifacts from a life interrupted. Warden Mills had never opened an evidence locker at the request of a dog before, and the surreal nature of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present as Luna, still weak but determined, began sniffing methodically through items that represented the final remnants of Alexander's former existence. Sarah Chen felt her prosecutor's instincts rebelling against everything happening around her: 18 months of meticulous case building, hundreds of witness testimonies, thousands of documents proving Alexander's guilt, and now she was supposed to believe that a golden retriever might uncover evidence that an entire FBI investigation had missed? "This is insane," she muttered under her breath, but even as the words left her lips, she found herself leaning forward to watch Luna's systematic search through Alexander's belongings. The dog moved with purpose despite her weakened state, dismissing expensive watches, designer suits, and leather briefcases with barely a glance, her sensitive nose seeking something specific among the remnants of a billionaire's life. Dr. Hoffman, still documenting everything for what had become the most unusual psychological evaluation in legal history, noticed that Alexander himself seemed surprised by Luna's behavior, his face showing genuine confusion as his beloved pet rejected item after item that held sentimental value for him. "She's not looking for something that smells like me," Alexander said slowly, realization dawning in his voice. "She's looking for something that smells wrong." Luna suddenly froze beside a small black leather portfolio that Alexander didn't recognize, her entire body going rigid in the classic alert position that Captain Rodriguez had seen countless times in his work with detection dogs. "That's not mine," Alexander said immediately, his voice filled with bewilderment. "I've never seen that portfolio before in my life." The resistance to what Luna was revealing came swift and fierce from multiple directions, as if the very foundation of justice itself was being challenged by a 4-year-old golden retriever's nose. Elizabeth Harper, despite her growing sympathy for Alexander and Luna, felt her anger resurging as she watched the dog indicate evidence that could potentially exonerate the man responsible for her grandfather's financial ruin. "This is a show," she said harshly, her voice carrying the weight of 18 months of grief and rage. He's trained that dog to create reasonable doubt. My grandfather is dead because of this man's greed, and now we're supposed to believe his pet is going to prove his innocence." Her words struck the room like physical blows, and several other victims' family members who had remained after the evacuation began voicing similar sentiments, their need for justice warring with the growing evidence that something wasn't right about Alexander's case. Margaret Harper found herself caught between her veterinary knowledge, which told her that Luna's behavior was genuine detection work, not performance, and loyalty to her sister's pain. "Dogs can't be coached to fake scent detection," she said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction as she struggled with the implications of what she was suggesting. Sarah Chen, meanwhile, was experiencing a prosecutor's worst nightmare, doubt creeping into a case she'd considered airtight. She'd built her reputation on the Alexander Rothschild conviction, had been hailed as a champion of justice for bringing down one of America's most ruthless corporate criminals, and now a golden retriever was threatening to unravel everything she'd worked for. "We need to call the FBI," she said firmly, trying to regain control of the situation. "If there's evidence we missed, it needs to be processed through proper channels, not through a dog's nose in an execution chamber at midnight." Captain Rodriguez, however, was studying Luna's behavior with the experienced eye of someone who had seen detection work save lives and solve cases that had stumped human investigators for years. The golden retriever's alert was textbook perfect: rigid posture, focused attention, the specific breathing pattern that indicated she'd isolated a target scent from among hundreds of competing odors. "I've worked with federal detection teams for over a decade," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the growing arguments in the room. "This dog isn't performing tricks. She's showing us something we need to see." But even as he spoke, his own mind was wrestling with the implications. If Luna had detected evidence of Alexander's innocence, what did that say about the investigation that had put him on death row? What did it say about the system they'd all trusted to deliver justice? Alexander himself was perhaps the most resistant to what Luna was suggesting, his face showing a complex mixture of hope and terror as he stared at the black portfolio his dog had identified. "I can't let myself believe this," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the room's tension. "I've accepted my guilt, made peace with my death. I've spent 18 months preparing to pay for what I did to those families, and if there's evidence that I didn't..." His voice broke completely as the weight of possibility crashed over him. "What if I've been telling myself I deserve to die for crimes I didn't commit? What if those families have been grieving based on lies?" Dr. Hoffman recognized the psychological defense mechanism immediately. After 18 months of guilt and self-condemnation, Alexander's mind was protecting itself from the trauma of potentially false imprisonment by rejecting the possibility of innocence. "It's common for wrongly convicted individuals to resist evidence of their innocence," he explained to the room. "The psychological cost of accepting that you've suffered unjustly can be greater than accepting guilt for crimes you didn't commit." The tension in the room reached a breaking point as Luna, despite her weakened condition, began pawing at the mysterious portfolio with increasing urgency, her soft whines taking on a desperate quality that seemed to plead with the humans to understand what she was trying to show them. Warden Mills found herself caught between protocol and an increasingly undeniable truth: this dog had already saved 47 lives tonight, and her behavior suggested she was trying to save one more. "We open it," she decided finally, her voice cutting through the arguments and resistance. "We open it, we document everything, and we let the evidence speak for itself." But Sarah Chen stepped forward, her prosecutor's training warring with the growing uncertainty in her chest. "Warden, with all due respect, this is a federal case. That portfolio could contain privileged information, classified documents, evidence that could compromise ongoing investigations. We don't have the authority to." She was interrupted by Luna's sudden collapse, the golden retriever's strength finally giving out after her prolonged exposure to toxic gas and her desperate efforts to communicate with the humans around her. Alexander's anguished cry filled the chamber as he dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her still form as Margaret rushed to check her vital signs. "She's breathing, but barely," Margaret said urgently. She needs immediate veterinary care, oxygen therapy, for fluids. We're losing her. The sight of Luna's collapse seemed to galvanize everyone present in ways that arguments about protocol and procedure couldn't, stripping away their resistance and revealing the fundamental truth that had brought them all to this moment. A dog who loved unconditionally had risked her life to save strangers, and now she was dying for it. Elizabeth Harper found herself kneeling beside Alexander, her earlier anger forgotten as she watched him whisper desperate encouragements to his unconscious companion. "Fight, Luna," he pleaded. "Please fight. You've done so much good tonight, saved so many people. Don't leave me now." His raw vulnerability, stripped of all pretense and corporate armor, revealed a depth of humanity that Elizabeth hadn't expected to find in the man she'd blamed for her grandfather's death. The portfolio that Luna had identified sat unopened on the evidence shelf, but its very presence had already changed the dynamic in the room in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Margaret Harper, working frantically to stabilize Luna's breathing, found herself looking up at Alexander with new eyes. This wasn't the cold, calculating monster from the news reports, but a man whose entire world had narrowed to the life of a golden retriever who had sacrificed herself trying to save him. "The way you love her," Margaret said quietly as she worked, "it's not fake. You can't fake that kind of bond." Sarah Chen, watching the scene unfold, felt her carefully constructed case beginning to crumble not because of evidence or legal arguments, but because of something far more fundamental, the recognition that she might have been wrong about the essential nature of the man she'd helped condemn. "Dogs are excellent judges of character," she found herself saying, the words feeling like betrayal even as she spoke them. "If Luna loves you this much, if she's willing to die trying to save you." Dr. Hoffman was documenting everything, but his clinical observations were being overwhelmed by the emotional reality of what he was witnessing. "In 18 months of evaluation, I never saw Alexander show genuine emotion about anything," he said to Warden Mills. "But this is real. This is who he actually is underneath everything else." Captain Rodriguez, meanwhile, was studying the portfolio with growing conviction, his detection training telling him that Luna's indication had been genuine and urgent. "Whatever's in there," he said quietly, "she died trying to show it to us. The least we can do is honor her sacrifice by looking." The word "died" hung in the air like a physical blow, and Alexander's broken sob seemed to echo off the chamber walls as he pressed his face against Luna's still form. But just as the room began to accept that they had lost the dog who had saved them all, Luna's eyes fluttered open, and she fixed her gaze directly on the unopened portfolio, her tail giving one weak but determined wag that seemed to say, "Please. For all of us. Open it." And in that moment, the resistance that had filled the room began to crumble, replaced by a growing understanding that sometimes truth comes not through human investigation or legal process, but through the unwavering love and loyalty of a golden retriever who refuses to let injustice prevail. The emergency veterinary team that arrived at Pennsylvania State Penitentiary at 1:47 a.m. had never treated a patient inside an execution chamber, but Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the lead emergency vet, took one look at Luna's condition and immediately commandeered the space as a makeshift animal ICU. "I need this room sealed until she's stable," she announced with the authority of someone who had spent 15 years saving lives that couldn't speak for themselves. "No one leaves, no one enters. This dog has severe respiratory distress from toxic gas exposure, and moving her could kill her." The declaration created an unprecedented situation. 47 people who had come to witness an execution now found themselves trapped together in forced proximity, bound by the fragile life of a golden retriever who had saved them all. Warden Mills tried to protest the breach of protocol, but Dr. Martinez cut her off with a look that could have melted steel. "This animal risked her life to save every person in this room. The least we can do is give her a fighting chance." As oxygen equipment and 4 lines were hastily set up around Luna's unconscious form, the strange fellowship of witnesses, officials, and family members settled into an uncomfortable vigil that none of them had anticipated. Alexander remained on his knees beside Luna, his hand gently stroking her fur as monitors tracked her vital signs with electronic beeps that seemed to count down more than time. They seemed to measure hope itself. The black portfolio sat nearby, unopened but impossible to ignore, like a secret that demanded to be revealed but couldn't be addressed until Luna was safe. Dr. Martinez worked with the focused intensity of someone fighting death itself, her movements precise and controlled as she stabilized the dog's breathing and began the delicate process of purging the toxic gas from Luna's system. The forced proximity created unexpected conversations and connections that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, as people who had never spoken found themselves sharing space, stories, and growing doubts about everything they thought they knew. Elizabeth Harper, who had spent 18 months nurturing her hatred for Alexander Rothschild, found herself sitting just 3 feet from him as they both watched Luna fight for her life, and the proximity forced her to see details she'd never noticed before, the way his hands trembled not with fear for himself but with terror for his dog, the genuine tears that had nothing to do with self-pity, the quiet words of encouragement he whispered to Luna that revealed a tenderness she hadn't expected to find in someone she'd considered a monster. "Tell me about her," Elizabeth said suddenly, surprising herself with the request. Alexander looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and vulnerable. "I found her at a kill shelter 2 weeks before they were going to put her down," he said quietly. "She was just 8 weeks old, abandoned because she had a heart murmur that made her unsuitable for breeding. The shelter said no one would want a defective puppy." His voice broke slightly as he continued, "I was in the worst period of my life then, consumed by greed and ambition, but something about this tiny golden ball of fur who had been rejected for not being perfect, she chose me. Despite everything I was, she chose to love me." Margaret Harper, monitoring Luna's breathing patterns with her veterinary expertise, found herself drawn into the conversation despite her determination to remain professionally detached. "Heart murmurs in puppies often resolve as they grow," she said gently. "She probably outgrew it completely." Alexander nodded, his eyes never leaving Luna's face. "The vet said her heart was perfect by her first birthday. But by then, I realized mine wasn't. She was teaching me how to love something more than money, more than power, more than myself." Sarah Chen, the prosecutor who had built her career on Alexander's conviction, found herself in the most difficult position of all as the forced proximity made it impossible to maintain the professional distance she'd cultivated during the trial. Sitting across from victims' families, she could see the pain in their faces, the need for someone to blame for their losses, but she could also see the growing confusion as they watched Alexander's genuine anguish over Luna's condition. "This doesn't make sense," whispered James Morrison, whose mother had lost her retirement savings. "Sociopaths don't love like this. They can't." Sarah had prosecuted enough criminals to know he was right. She'd never seen a defendant show this level of authentic emotion for anything or anyone, and it was forcing her to question everything about the case she'd built. Dr. Hoffman, trapped in his role as both observer and participant, was documenting the most extraordinary psychological transformation he'd ever witnessed, not just in Alexander but in everyone present. "Shared trauma creates unexpected bonds," he murmured to Captain Rodriguez, who was helping Dr. Martinez monitor Luna's oxygen levels. "But this is more than that. That dog is serving as a bridge between people who should be enemies, forcing them to see each other's humanity." The captain nodded grimly as he watched Luna's vital signs fluctuate on the monitors. "She's still fighting," he said quietly. "Even unconscious, she's still fighting. Dogs like this, they don't give up on the people they love." The words carried a weight that seemed to settle over everyone in the room, because if Luna wouldn't give up on Alexander, what did that say about the man they'd all come to see executed? As the hours stretched on and dawn began to filter through the chamber's small windows, the forced proximity was breaking down barriers that had seemed insurmountable, creating space for questions that no one had dared to ask before. The mysterious black portfolio continued to dominate everyone's thoughts as they maintained their vigil around Luna's still form, but it was Captain Rodriguez who finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "If we're going to be trapped here until she recovers, and if that portfolio contains evidence that could change everything, Don't we owe it to everyone, including Luna, to find out what she died trying to show us? His words created a ripple of tension through the room, because opening the portfolio would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, potentially unraveling not just Alexander's case but the entire foundation of justice they'd all believed in. Sarah Chen felt the weight of her prosecutorial oath warring with a growing certainty that something fundamental was wrong with the case she'd built. If I authorize opening that portfolio, and if it contains evidence of Alexander's innocence, it means I helped convict an innocent man, she said quietly, her voice barely audible above Luna's labored breathing. It means I destroyed the lives of everyone in this room for nothing. Elizabeth Harper, who had spent so many nights dreaming of Alexander's execution, found herself speaking words she never thought she'd utter, but if you don't authorize it, and if Luna dies trying to show us proof of his innocence, then we're all complicit in murdering an innocent man. The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. Opening the portfolio risked destroying the closure that victims' families desperately needed, but not opening it risked perpetuating an injustice that a dying dog had sacrificed herself to prevent. Dr. Martinez, focused entirely on saving Luna's life, looked up from her medical equipment with eyes blazing with determination. This dog has shown more courage and integrity in one night than most humans show in a lifetime, she said firmly. If she's trying to tell us something, I think we owe it to her to listen. Alexander, who had remained silent during most of the debate, finally spoke with a voice that carried the weight of 18 months of accepting guilt he might not deserve. Open it, he said simply. Whatever's in there, whatever it proves or disproves, Luna tried to show it to us for a reason. She's never been wrong about anything that mattered. The moment of truth arrived with the soft click of the portfolio's clasp opening, but what spilled out onto the evidence table was so unexpected that it took several moments for anyone to comprehend what they were seeing. Instead of the financial documents or corporate records everyone had anticipated, the portfolio contained dozens of photographs, video stills, and what appeared to be surveillance documentation, but not of Alexander's alleged crimes. The images showed Alexander in locations and situations that directly contradicted the timeline of events that had formed the backbone of Sarah Chen's case against him. Dr. Hoffman picked up one of the photographs with trembling hands, his psychiatric training helping him analyze what he was seeing. This photo shows Alexander at a children's hospital in Philadelphia, donating anonymously to pediatric cancer research, he said slowly. The timestamp shows it was taken during the exact time period when the prosecution claimed he was in Switzerland moving stolen pension funds. Margaret Harper examined another photograph, this one showing Alexander at what appeared to be an animal rescue facility. This is him volunteering at the rescue where he found Luna, she said, her voice filled with growing amazement. But according to the trial transcripts, he was supposed to be in meetings with offshore banking officials on this date. Sarah Chen felt her world crumbling as she looked through document after document that painted a picture of a man whose public life had been carefully manufactured to hide not criminal activity, but extensive charitable work that he'd kept secret from everyone including his own corporation. These aren't just photographs, she whispered, her prosecutors recognizing the significance of what she was seeing. These are surveillance photos. Someone was documenting Alexander's movements, but not to prove his guilt, to prove his innocence. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If Alexander had been under beneficial surveillance that documented his whereabouts during the times he was alleged to be committing crimes, then someone had deliberately suppressed evidence that would have exonerated him. Luna, as if sensing the shift in energy around her, stirred slightly on her oxygen mask, her eyes fluttering open to look directly at the open portfolio before giving the weakest possible tail wag, a gesture that seemed to say, finally. Now you understand. And as the truth began to dawn on everyone in that execution chamber, they realized they weren't just witnessing the end of a wrongful conviction, but the beginning of a revelation about corruption and conspiracy that reached far deeper than any of them had imagined. The surveillance photographs scattered across the evidence table told a story that none of them had been prepared to hear, but it was Margaret Harper who made the connection that would unravel everything they thought they knew about Alexander Rothschild's case. As a veterinarian, she was trained to notice details that others might miss, and what she saw in the background of one photograph made her blood run cold. "That's Dr. Vincent Carrera," she said quietly, pointing to a figure partially visible in the corner of a photo showing Alexander at the animal rescue. "He was the veterinarian who treated my grandfather's dog just before Grandpa's financial collapse. He was also the one who recommended that Grandpa invest his retirement funds with Rothschild Industries." The room fell silent except for the steady beep of Luna's monitors as the implications of Margaret's observation sank in. Dr. Hoffman, his psychiatric training kicking in as he analyzed the emerging pattern, began laying out more photographs in chronological order. "These surveillance photos don't just show Alexander's whereabouts," he said slowly. "They show him being systematically followed by the same group of people over a period of months. Look, same cars, same agents, always maintaining distance." Sarah Chen, her prosecutor's mind racing to piece together a conspiracy she was only beginning to understand, picked up a photograph that showed Alexander leaving a children's hospital with a timestamp that placed him thousands of miles from where the prosecution had claimed he was orchestrating pension fund theft. If someone was documenting his charitable activities and his real whereabouts, and if they had this evidence during his trial. Her voice trailed off as the horrifying truth began to emerge. They let an innocent man be convicted. They had proof of his innocence and they buried it. Alexander, watching from Luna's side as his life was reconstructed through photographic evidence, felt 18 months of accepted guilt crashing down around him like a house of cards. "The day before my arrest," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "Luna kept trying to lead me to my home office. She was pawing at my filing cabinet, whining at my desk. I thought she was just anxious about the FBI presence, but..." He looked up at the assembled group with dawning realization. What if she was trying to show me this portfolio? What if someone planted it in my office, and she was trying to warn me? The backstory that emerged from the photographs was more complex and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined, revealing not just Alexander's innocence but the systematic destruction of a man whose only crime had been becoming an inconvenient obstacle to a much larger conspiracy. Captain Rodriguez, using his investigative experience to analyze the surveillance documentation, discovered that the photos were arranged in a specific sequence that told a story of deliberate targeting. "These images show Alexander being tracked for over 8 months before his arrest," he said, laying out the evidence like pieces of a puzzle. "But they're not tracking criminal activity, they're tracking charitable work that he was keeping secret from his own board of directors." Dr. Martinez, still monitoring Luna's recovery but listening intently to the unfolding revelation, looked up from her medical equipment with growing anger. "You're telling me that someone documented proof of this man's innocence and then let him sit on death row for 18 months while a dog who loved him suffered separation and abandonment?" Her words carried the moral outrage of someone who dedicated her life to protecting innocent creatures, and they seemed to crystallize the horror of what everyone was beginning to understand. Elizabeth Harper, her worldview crumbling as she realized her grandfather's death had been caused not by Alexander's greed but by a conspiracy that had used Alexander as a scapegoat, sank into a chair with her hands shaking. If Alexander wasn't stealing the pension funds, then who was, she asked, her voice hollow with the weight of misdirected grief. Who let my grandfather die believing he'd been betrayed by someone who was actually trying to help people? Sarah Chen was frantically cross-referencing the photographic evidence with her case files, her prosecutor's mind working to unravel 18 months of what she was now realizing had been carefully orchestrated lies. "The financial trail that led to Alexander," she said urgently, "it was too clean, too obvious. We thought we'd found a smoking gun, but what if it was planted? What if someone wanted us to find it?" Dr. Hoffman, studying the psychological profile that was emerging from the surveillance photos, saw a pattern that chilled him to the bone. "These photos show a man engaged in secret philanthropy on a massive scale," he said quietly. "Anonymous donations to children's hospitals, funding for animal rescues, support for elderly care facilities. Alexander wasn't hiding criminal activity, He was hiding altruism from a corporate culture that would have seen kindness as weakness. The most devastating revelation came when Captain Rodriguez discovered a series of photographs that showed not just Alexander's charitable activities, but the people who had been watching him document those activities. These surveillance teams weren't law enforcement, he said grimly, his experience in federal operations allowing him to identify details that others would miss. These are private contractors, corporate security. Someone hired them to build a case against Alexander, not to investigate actual crimes. The implications were staggering. Not only was Alexander innocent of the charges that had put him on death row, but his conviction had been the result of a deliberate conspiracy by people who had stood to benefit from his downfall. Margaret Harper, still processing the connection between Dr. Carrera and her grandfather's financial ruin, made another discovery that sent shockwaves through the room. Dr. Carrera isn't just a veterinarian, she said, her voice tight with growing anger. He's on the board of directors for Meridian Financial, the company that took over Rothschild Industries' assets after Alexander's arrest. The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Alexander had been set up not by random corruption, but by his own board of directors who had wanted to seize control of his company and needed him eliminated to do it. Sarah Chen felt physically sick as she realized the magnitude of the injustice she had unwittingly helped perpetrate. They used the legal system as a weapon, she said, her voice filled with self-recrimination. They fed me evidence, guided my investigation, made me believe I was serving justice when I was actually serving corporate greed. Alexander, listening to the unraveling of his life story, felt a complex mixture of vindication and devastation. $47 billion, he said quietly. That's what Rothschild Industries was worth when I was arrested. If they eliminated me and seized my assets under criminal forfeiture laws. Elizabeth Harper finished the thought with horrified understanding. They didn't just steal pension funds. They stole your entire company by framing you for stealing pension funds. Luna, as if sensing the emotional weight of the revelation surrounding her, stirred on her oxygen mask and managed to lift her head just enough to look at Alexander with eyes that seemed to say, "I tried to tell you. I tried to warn you." The sight of his beloved companion fighting to comfort him even while fighting for her own life broke something fundamental in Alexander's chest, and his tears fell not just for his own injustice but for 18 months of separation from the one being who had truly understood his innocence. The backstory that the photographs revealed painted Alexander Rothschild as perhaps the most tragic victim of corporate conspiracy in modern legal history, a man whose secret philanthropy and genuine attempts to use his wealth for good had made him a target for elimination by the very people he had trusted to run his company. Dr. Hoffman, analyzing the psychological profile that emerged from the surveillance documentation, realized that Alexander's secretive charitable work explained every aspect of his personality that had seemed contradictory during their counseling sessions. "You were hiding your kindness," he said with growing amazement. "In a corporate culture that rewarded ruthlessness, you were secretly funding children's hospitals and animal rescues, and you were afraid that if your board of directors found out, they'd see it as weakness and move against you." Alexander nodded slowly, the weight of 18 months of self-doubt finally beginning to lift. "I was raised to believe that showing compassion was a liability in business," he said quietly. "But Luna changed everything. When I found her at that kill shelter, when I saw how she'd been discarded for being imperfect, I realized I was becoming the kind of person who would throw away something precious because it didn't meet arbitrary standards of value." Captain Rodriguez, studying the surveillance timeline, made a discovery that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. "These photos show that they started tracking you the day after you made a public statement about reforming pension fund management," he said grimly. "Your own board set you up the moment you tried to protect the very people they were planning to rob." The revelation hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Alexander hadn't been targeted for crimes he'd committed, but for reforms he'd tried to implement that would have prevented the real criminals from looting pension funds. Sarah Chen, her prosecutor's mind now working to understand how she'd been manipulated, realized the sophisticated nature of the setup. They didn't just plant evidence, she said with growing horror. They engineered my entire investigation. Every lead I followed, every witness I interviewed, every piece of evidence I uncovered, it was all carefully orchestrated to lead me to Alexander while the real criminals covered their tracks. Elizabeth Harper, grappling with the realization that her grandfather had died believing himself betrayed by the one man who might have saved him, looked at Alexander with tears streaming down her face. "You were trying to protect people like my grandfather, weren't you?" she asked. Alexander's response came in a voice so filled with regret that it seemed to echo off the chamber walls. "I was too late. By the time I realized what my board was planning, they'd already moved against the pension funds. I tried to stop them, tried to restore the stolen money from my personal accounts, but they used my attempts to help as evidence that I was admitting guilt." The cruel irony was devastating. Alexander's efforts to compensate victims had been twisted into proof of his culpability, and his secret philanthropy had been hidden while his manufactured crimes were broadcast to the world. As Luna's breathing grew stronger and the truth about Alexander's innocence became undeniable, the most heartbreaking revelation was yet to come. Dr. Martinez, monitoring Luna's recovery, noticed something in the dog's medical history that connected to everything they had discovered. "According to her veterinary records," she said quietly, "Luna has been suffering from separation anxiety and depression since Alexander's arrest. She's been refusing food, losing weight, showing all the signs of an animal grieving for a lost pack member." The revelation added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating story. Luna hadn't just been waiting for Alexander to return, she'd been literally dying of heartbreak, her physical health deteriorating as her emotional world collapsed around his absence. Margaret Harper, her veterinary expertise helping her understand the full scope of Luna's suffering, looked at the surveillance photos with new eyes. "These pictures of Alexander at animal rescues," she said softly, "he was trying to save dogs like Luna. Dogs that had been abandoned or marked for euthanasia because they weren't profitable or convenient." The connection between Alexander's secret philanthropy and his love for Luna painted a picture of a man whose compassion had been weaponized against him by people who saw kindness as exploitable weakness. Captain Rodriguez, studying the final photographs in the sequence, made a discovery that would change everything once again. "These last photos," he said urgently, "they show Alexander meeting with FBI agents 3 days before his arrest. But not as a suspect, as an informant. He was trying to expose the pension fund theft." The implications were staggering. Alexander hadn't just been innocent of the crimes he'd been convicted of, he'd been actively working to prevent them when his own conspirators had framed him to stop his investigation. Sarah Chen felt the last foundations of her case crumble as she realized that the man she'd helped condemn had actually been trying to serve justice, while she'd unknowingly been serving the very criminals he'd been fighting against. As Luna's eyes opened fully for the first time since her collapse, looking directly at Alexander with a gaze full of forgiveness and unconditional love, everyone in that execution chamber understood that they hadn't just witnessed the salvation of an innocent man, they'd witnessed the power of loyalty and love to reveal truth that human systems had been designed to hide. And as Alexander whispered, "I'm sorry, Luna. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you from all of this," the golden retriever's tail gave a weak but determined wag that seemed to say, "You did protect me. You loved me. And that's all I ever needed." The transformation in the execution chamber was so profound that Dr. Martinez later described it as watching enemies become family in the space of a single heartbeat, as Luna's full recovery catalyzed an emotional bonding between people who should have remained forever divided by grief and guilt. Alexander, finally able to hold Luna properly as she regained her strength, found himself surrounded not by the hostile witnesses who had come to watch him die, but by people whose understanding of him had been fundamentally altered by 18 months of misdirected pain finally finding its true target. Elizabeth Harper, who had dreamed of this moment as revenge, instead found herself kneeling beside Alexander and Luna, her hand gently stroking the golden retriever's fur as she whispered apologies that seemed to encompass years of misplaced hatred. "I wanted you to suffer," she said quietly, her voice thick with tears. I spent every night for 18 months imagining your death, and now. She looked up at Alexander with eyes that held wonder instead of rage. Now I realize you were suffering too, just in a different way. You lost everything trying to protect people like my grandfather, and we blamed you for the crimes of the people who destroyed you. Luna, sensing the emotional shift in the woman who had wished for Alexander's death, gently placed her paw on Elizabeth's hand in a gesture of forgiveness that seemed to bridge 18 months of hatred with simple, wordless compassion. Margaret Harper watched her sister's transformation with amazement, but found herself experiencing her own profound shift as she studied Alexander's interaction with Luna through the lens of her veterinary training. "The bond between you two," she said softly, "it's unlike anything I've seen in 15 years of practice. She doesn't just love you, she understands you on a level that transcends normal human-animal relationships." Alexander's response revealed depths of vulnerability that none of them had expected to find in a man they'd seen as a corporate monster. "She saved my soul long before she saved our lives tonight," he said, his voice filled with wonder as Luna pressed her face against his chest. "I was becoming everything I hated about the business world, cold, calculating, willing to sacrifice anything for profit. But Luna, she showed me what unconditional love looked like, and it made me remember who I wanted to be instead of who I thought I had to be." The bonding between Alexander and the victims' families deepened as shared stories replaced accusations, creating a space for healing that none of them had thought possible just hours before. Sarah Chen, her prosecutor's mask finally slipping completely, found herself sitting beside Alexander as Luna dozed peacefully between them, her breathing steady and strong after her brush with death. "I destroyed your life," Sarah said simply, her voice carrying the weight of professional and personal failure. "I was so convinced of your guilt that I never looked for evidence of your innocence. I turned you into a monster to serve my own need to believe in justice." Alexander's response revealed a capacity for forgiveness that seemed to echo Luna's own unconditional acceptance. "You were manipulated by people who were much better at deception than either of us realized," he said gently. "You thought you were serving justice, and I let myself believe I deserved punishment because I felt guilty for not stopping the real criminal sooner." The conversation that followed revealed layers of shared trauma that had been hidden beneath their adversarial relationship. Sarah's drive to prosecute corporate crime stemmed from her own father's pension being stolen by executives who had never faced consequences, while Alexander's secretive philanthropy had been motivated by childhood memories of his own family losing everything to corporate greed. Dr. Hoffman, documenting the extraordinary psychological healing taking place around Luna's recovery, realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in his professional experience. "Shared trauma is creating empathy where there should be impossible divisions," he murmured to Captain Rodriguez, who was watching the scene unfold with his own sense of amazement. "That dog isn't just healing physically, she's healing relationships that should have been permanently destroyed by injustice." James Morrison, whose mother's death had been directly linked to the pension fund theft, surprised everyone by being the first to voice what they were all beginning to feel. "My mom always said that love finds a way to heal even the deepest wounds," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on Luna's peaceful form. "Looking at you with that dog, seeing how much you love her and how much she loves you. I can't hold on to hatred for someone who's capable of that kind of genuine affection." The emotional bonding reached its peak when Luna, now strong enough to move around the chamber, began what could only be described as a mission of reconciliation, moving from person to person with the intuitive wisdom that seemed to guide everything she did. She approached Elizabeth Harper first, gently placing her head in the woman's lap with a soft whine that seemed to acknowledge the grief Elizabeth had carried for her grandfather. "She knows," Elizabeth whispered in amazement. "She actually knows that I've been in pain." Luna's response was to press closer against Elizabeth, offering the same comfort she had given Alexander during his darkest moments of guilt and despair. Margaret Harper watched her sister's face transform as Luna's presence seemed to dissolve 18 months of bitter anger, replacing it with something that looked suspiciously like peace. "Animals don't lie about their feelings," Margaret said softly. "If Luna is choosing to comfort you, it's because she sees something in you that deserves comfort." When Luna moved to Sarah Chen, the prosecutor initially tried to pull away, her guilt making her feel unworthy of affection from the dog whose owner she had nearly executed. But Luna was persistent, nudging Sarah's hand until the woman began stroking her fur, and in that moment Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death, the possibility of forgiveness, both given and received. "I don't deserve your kindness," Sarah whispered to Luna, but the golden retriever's response was to rest her chin on Sarah's knee with a patience that seemed infinite. Dr. Martinez, still monitoring Luna's recovery but now fascinated by her emotional intelligence, made an observation that stunned everyone in the room. "This dog is displaying advanced therapeutic behavior," she said with professional amazement. "She's instinctively providing exactly the kind of emotional support that each person needs. It's like she's reading their psychological states and responding with perfect empathy." Alexander watched Luna's rounds with a pride so profound it seemed to fill the entire chamber, his love for her magnified by witnessing her capacity to heal others the same way she had healed him. The most powerful moment of bonding came when Luna returned to Alexander's side, but instead of settling down to rest, she looked up at him with an expression that seemed to convey urgent communication, then walked purposefully to the evidence table where the surveillance photos were still scattered. Captain Rodriguez, his experience with detection dogs helping him interpret her behavior, realized what Luna was trying to do. "She wants to show you something specific," he said to Alexander. "Not just the photos, but something about the photos." Following Luna's lead, Alexander approached the evidence table and began studying the surveillance images with new eyes, looking not just at the documentation of his innocence but at the deeper story they told about his relationship with Luna and the life they had built together before the conspiracy destroyed everything. One photograph in particular caught his attention, an image of him and Luna at a children's hospital, where he was making one of his anonymous donations while Luna provided comfort to young patients in the cancer ward. "She was always part of my charitable work," Alexander said with growing wonder. "I thought I was protecting her by keeping her away from the business world, but she was actually helping me remember why the work mattered." The revelation that Luna had been his partner in philanthropy, not just his companion in solitude, added another layer to their bond that made everyone present understand why the golden retriever had fought so hard to save him. Elizabeth Harper, studying the hospital photograph, made a connection that brought tears to her eyes. "That little girl in the picture," she said softly, "she's wearing the same bracelet my grandfather used to wear, the one for diabetes awareness. Were you funding diabetes research too?" Alexander nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "After I met Luna, I started researching all the ways that medical conditions led to financial hardship for families. Diabetes care, cancer treatment, heart disease. I wanted to help people who were suffering the way my family had suffered when I was young." The revelation that Alexander's secret philanthropy had specifically targeted the same medical conditions that had affected the families of his accusers created a moment of recognition so profound that it seemed to rewrite the entire narrative of victim and perpetrator. As the bonding deepened and the emotional wounds began to heal through Luna's gentle mediation, the most unexpected friendship began to form between Alexander and Elizabeth Harper, two people whose pain had made them enemies but whose shared love for those they'd lost was making them allies. "My grandfather would have liked you," Elizabeth said quietly as Luna dozed peacefully between them. "He always said the measure of a person wasn't how much money they made, but how they treated those who couldn't do anything for them in return." Alexander's response revealed the depth of regret that had driven his secret charitable work. "I spent the first 40 years of my life proving I was nothing like the executives who destroyed my family," he said softly. "But somewhere along the way, I became exactly what I'd hated, until Luna taught me that success without compassion is just elaborate failure." The conversation that followed was unlike anything either of them had expected to have, as Elizabeth shared stories of her grandfather's kindness and Alexander revealed the childhood poverty that had shaped his drive for wealth and his eventual realization that money meant nothing without purpose. Dr. Hoffman, documenting what he was already recognizing as a groundbreaking case study in trauma recovery and forgiveness, noted that Luna seemed to understand exactly when to intervene in the conversation, offering physical comfort when emotions became too intense and providing a calming presence that allowed both Alexander and Elizabeth to be vulnerable with each other. Sarah Chen, watching the unlikely friendship develop, found herself thinking about justice in ways she'd never considered before. True justice isn't just about punishment, she said quietly to Margaret Harper. It's about healing the harm that was done and preventing it from happening again. What if we've been approaching this all wrong? Margaret nodded, her veterinary experience giving her a unique perspective on healing. Animals don't seek revenge, she observed. They seek connection and safety. Maybe that's what we should be seeking too. As Luna stretched contentedly between Alexander and Elizabeth, her tail wagging slowly in a rhythm that seemed to match the growing harmony in the room, everyone present began to understand that they weren't just witnessing the healing of individual relationships, they were witnessing the birth of something entirely new, a chosen family born from shared trauma, guided by the wisdom of a golden retriever who understood that love was always stronger than hatred, and forgiveness more powerful than revenge. The fragile peace that had settled over the execution chamber shattered like glass at 6:47 a.m. when Warden Mill's radio erupted with urgent voices that would tear apart everything the group had built through their night of revelation and healing. "Warden, this is Director Harrison from FBI headquarters," the voice crackled with official authority that cut through the warm atmosphere like a blade. "We have federal marshals en route to your facility with orders to transfer prisoner Rothschild to a secure federal location immediately. The execution has been postponed pending a national security review of classified materials found in his possession." The words hit everyone in the chamber like physical blows, but it was the phrase, classified materials, that made Sarah Chen's blood run cold, because she knew exactly what it meant. Someone was still orchestrating Alexander's destruction, and they weren't going to let a golden retriever's loyalty derail 18 months of careful planning. Alexander instinctively pulled Luna closer as the reality crashed over him, his voice breaking as he whispered, "They're not going to let me go. Even with all this evidence, even knowing I'm innocent, they're going to find another way to destroy me." Dr. Hoffman, his psychiatric training helping him recognize the signs of systemic psychological manipulation, realized they were witnessing the final move in a chess game that had been rigged from the beginning. "The classified materials," he said urgently to the group, "they're probably documents Alexander never saw, planted in his belongings to create a new charge when the murder conviction falls apart. Someone has been anticipating this moment." Luna, sensing the shift in energy around her beloved human, began whimpering with the same distress she'd shown before detecting the gas leak, her instincts telling her that danger was approaching even if she couldn't understand its nature. Elizabeth Harper, who had just begun to process her transformed understanding of Alexander, felt her carefully rebuilt world threatening to collapse again. "They can't do this," she said desperately. "Not after everything we've learned, not after seeing who you really are." But even as she spoke, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching the facility echoed through the chamber's walls, carrying the promise that their newfound family was about to be torn apart by forces beyond their control. The shatterpoint intensified when Captain Rodriguez made a discovery that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy they were facing, his investigation of the surveillance photos uncovering a detail that changed everything they thought they understood about their situation. "These photos," he said with growing alarm, "they're not just evidence of Alexander's innocence. They're evidence of a federal operation that was compromised from the inside." His hands trembling as he spread the images across the evidence table, Rodriguez pointed to background details that only his trained eye had noticed. Federal agents in the surveillance photos who were supposed to be investigating Alexander were actually coordinating with the same private contractors who had been building the case against him. "This goes all the way to the top," he said quietly. "The FBI officials ordering Alexander's transfer aren't trying to protect national security, they're trying to protect themselves from exposure." Sarah Chen felt the last foundations of her faith in the justice system crumble as she realized the implications of Rodriguez's discovery. If federal agents were involved in framing Alexander, she said with horror, then everyone who helped convict him, including me, we're all witnesses to a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of law enforcement. The revelation that their night of healing and discovery had actually painted targets on all their backs sent a chill through the chamber that had nothing to do with the morning air. Dr. Martinez, still monitoring Luna's recovery, looked up from her medical equipment with fierce determination. If they're coming to separate Alexander from Luna again, she said with the protective instinct of someone who had spent her career defending innocent creatures, they'll have to go through me first. That dog nearly died trying to save him and expose the truth. I won't let them destroy her again. Margaret Harper, her veterinary oath compelling her to protect Luna at all costs, stepped beside Dr. Martinez in solidarity. Luna is still recovering from toxic gas exposure, she declared with professional authority. Moving her or separating her from her bonded human could cause fatal stress. As her attending veterinarian, I'm declaring her medically unfit for any kind of separation or transport. The two women's determination to protect Luna created a barrier that even federal authority would struggle to overcome, but everyone in the room knew that legal technicalities wouldn't stop people who had already proven willing to frame an innocent man for capital murder. The emotional devastation reached its peak when Alexander, realizing that his fight for justice might end up destroying the people who had risked everything to help him, made a decision that broke everyone's heart but revealed the depth of his transformation. I won't let them hurt any of you because of me, he said quietly, his arms tightening around Luna as if trying to memorize the feeling of holding her. If I go with them voluntarily, if I don't fight the transfer, maybe they'll leave you all alone. His words sent Luna into immediate distress, her whimpers becoming desperate cries as she seemed to understand that separation was imminent, her tail tucked and her entire body trembling with the trauma of abandonment she'd already endured for 18 months. Elizabeth Harper, who had spent so much of the night learning to see Alexander's humanity, felt something inside her break at the sight of his willingness to sacrifice himself to protect them. No, she said fiercely, surprising herself with the intensity of her protective instinct toward the man she'd wanted dead just hours before. I won't let you do this. I won't let them take you away from Luna again, and I won't let them silence the truth we've discovered. But Alexander's response revealed the impossible choice he was facing between protecting Luna and protecting the people who had become his unexpected family. If I fight this, they'll find ways to destroy all of you, he said with the voice of a man who had learned too much about the reach of corrupt power. Sarah's career will be destroyed for helping prove my innocence. Elizabeth and Margaret will be targeted for interfering with federal operations. Dr. Hoffman and Captain Rodriguez will face charges for mishandling evidence. I can't let my fight for freedom cost you everything you've worked for. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. Alexander's compassion, the same quality that had made him a target for the conspiracy, was now making him willing to sacrifice his own salvation to protect others. Dr. Hoffman, recognizing the psychological trap that had been carefully constructed around Alexander, realized that the man's willingness to accept punishment for crimes he didn't commit wasn't just about guilt. It was about a lifetime of being taught that his needs were less important than protecting others, a conditioning that the conspirators were still exploiting to maintain their control. The betrayal that completed the shatter point came from the last person anyone expected, when Dr. Vincent Carrera, the veterinarian whose name Margaret had recognized in the surveillance photos, walked through the chamber doors flanked by federal marshals, his presence revealing the true scope of the conspiracy and the personal nature of the vendetta against Alexander. I'm here to examine the dog, Carrera announced with cold professional authority, his eyes avoiding Alexander's gaze as he approached Luna with a medical bag that everyone instinctively knew contained more than veterinary supplies. There are concerns about potential biological contamination from the gas exposure that could pose a public health risk. Margaret Harper's veterinary training immediately recognized the lie in Carrera's words, her voice rising with indignation as she stepped protectively in front of Luna. Nitrogen oxide exposure doesn't cause biological contamination, she said firmly. You know that as well as I do. Whatever you're planning to do to that dog, it has nothing to do with public health. Carrera's mask slipped slightly as he looked at Margaret with undisguised contempt. "You have no authority here, Dr. Harper. This is a federal matter involving national security and potential bioterrorism." The absurdity of his claims would have been laughable if the implications weren't so terrifying. They were prepared to label Luna a biological weapon to justify separating her from Alexander and potentially eliminating the living symbol of his innocence. Alexander, realizing that Luna was now in direct danger because of her loyalty to him, felt something break inside his chest that went deeper than his own fear of death. "Leave her alone," he said with quiet intensity that carried more threat than any shout. "She's done nothing but save lives and expose truth. If you hurt her, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you've done." But Carrera's response revealed the depth of personal hatred that had driven the conspiracy from its beginning. "You destroyed my family's company when you started your ethical reforms," he said with venom that had been festering for years. "My father built Meridian Financial from nothing, and your sanctimonious crusade against corporate greed cost us millions in potential profits. This isn't just about business, Rothschild, it's about making you pay for thinking you were better than the rest of us." The personal motivation behind Alexander's destruction added a layer of cruelty to everything they'd endured, revealing that Luna's suffering and Alexander's 18 months on death row had been driven not by justice or even corporate greed, but by petty revenge from someone who had never forgiven Alexander for choosing compassion over profit. As federal marshals moved to physically separate Alexander from Luna, the Golden Retriever's response was so heartbreaking and desperate that it seemed to crystallize every injustice they had witnessed and fought against throughout their long night together. Luna began howling with the same intensity she'd shown when detecting the gas leak, but this time her cries carried a different message, not warning of physical danger, but of emotional devastation that threatened to destroy the soul of the dog who had already sacrificed so much for love. She clung to Alexander with all her remaining strength, her paws scrambling against his chest as she tried to prevent the separation that her instincts told her might be permanent this time. "Please," Alexander begged the marshals, his own composure finally breaking completely as he held Luna's trembling form. "Don't do this to her. She's been traumatized enough. If you have to take me, let Dr. Martinez or Margaret keep her. She doesn't deserve to suffer for my crimes or my innocence." But Dr. Carrera's cold smile revealed that Luna's suffering was precisely the point, a final cruelty designed to break Alexander's spirit even if they couldn't break his body. "The dog is evidence," Carrera declared with false authority. "She'll be held in federal custody pending investigation of her role in tonight's events." Elizabeth Harper, watching Luna's anguish and Alexander's helpless grief, felt a rage so pure it seemed to burn away 18 months of misdirected anger, focusing all her protective instincts on the innocent creatures being destroyed by human cruelty. "Over my dead body," she said quietly, stepping between the marshals and Alexander with a determination that surprised everyone, including herself. Margaret joined her sister, followed by Sarah Chen, Dr. Hoffman, Dr. Martinez, Captain Rodriguez, and even James Morrison, creating a human barrier around Alexander and Luna that represented everything they had learned about love, loyalty, and justice during their extraordinary night together. But as the marshals prepared to break through their protective circle, and as Luna's howls echoed off the chamber walls like a soundtrack of injustice, everyone present understood that they were witnessing not just the destruction of Alexander and Luna's bond, but the shattering of every hope they had built for truth, healing, and redemption. The conspiracy that had brought them together was now tearing them apart, and the silence that followed Luna's final, broken whimper seemed to contain the death of everything beautiful they had discovered about second chances and the power of unconditional love. The moment of choice arrived not with dramatic fanfare but with the quiet desperation of Luna's labored breathing as she pressed against Alexander's chest, her eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that seemed to contain 18 months of separation, a lifetime of loyalty, and the absolute certainty that whatever happened next would determine not just their future but the very meaning of love itself. Alexander looked around at the human barrier that had formed to protect them, Elizabeth Harper, who had transformed from his would-be executioner into his fierce defender, Margaret Harper, whose veterinary oath had become a shield against injustice, Sarah Chen, whose prosecutorial integrity was finally serving truth instead of manipulation, Dr. Hoffman, Captain Rodriguez, Dr. to risk their careers and possibly their freedom to stand between corruption and innocence. The federal marshals hesitated, clearly unprepared for the solidarity they faced, while Dr. Carrera's mask of authority began to crack under the weight of unified opposition. "You're all making a mistake," Carrera said with forced confidence that didn't quite hide his growing unease. "This is a federal matter involving national security. Interfering with this operation will result in criminal charges for everyone in this room." But Elizabeth Harper, her voice steady with newfound purpose, responded with words that seemed to speak for everyone present. "The only crime here is what you've done to an innocent man and his dog. We won't be part of your conspiracy anymore." Alexander felt the weight of the choice before him. He could surrender peacefully and hope that his sacrifice would protect the people who had risked everything for him, or he could fight back with the knowledge that his resistance might destroy the lives of everyone who had shown him kindness. Luna, as if sensing his internal struggle, placed her paw on his hand and looked up at him with eyes that seemed to say, "Whatever you choose, I choose it too. We're together." And in that moment, Alexander Rothschild made the first truly selfish decision of his adult life. He chose to fight for his own happiness, for Luna's well-being, and for the right to love and be loved without apology or fear. The choice to resist became a coordinated effort that revealed the extraordinary transformation each person had undergone during their night of revelation, as they moved with the precision of people who had found something worth fighting for and refused to let it be destroyed by forces that had already caused too much pain. Sarah Chen, her prosecutor's training now serving justice instead of manipulation, pulled out her phone and began recording everything, her voice clear and professional as she documented the attempted illegal seizure of evidence and the harassment of witnesses who had exposed federal corruption. "Dr. Carrera, you are not a federal agent, you have no authority to declare anything a matter of national security, and your presence here constitutes obstruction of justice in an active investigation of prosecutorial misconduct," she said with the authority of someone who had finally found the right side of the law. Margaret Harper, meanwhile, was using her veterinary credentials to examine Luna with deliberate thoroughness, her professional assessment creating a medical record that would make any attempt to harm or separate the dog a matter of public record. "Luna shows signs of severe psychological trauma from prolonged separation from her bonded human," she announced loudly enough for Sarah's recording to capture. Any further separation could result in fatal stress response. "As her attending veterinarian, I'm recommending immediate reunification therapy and declaring any attempt to remove her from Alexander's care to be medical malpractice and animal cruelty." Dr. Hoffman stepped forward with his own professional authority, his psychiatric evaluation taking on the weight of expert testimony. "Mr. Rothschild shows clear signs of having been psychologically manipulated and emotionally abused by a systematic campaign of false imprisonment," he declared. "The evidence of his innocence, combined with the documented conspiracy against him, indicates that he is the victim of one of the most sophisticated cases of institutional gaslighting in modern legal history." Captain Rodriguez, his federal law enforcement credentials carrying weight that even the marshals had to respect, made his own choice to stand with truth over authority. "The surveillance evidence we've uncovered tonight indicates federal crimes including conspiracy, evidence tampering, perjury, and violation of civil rights under color of law," he announced. "Dr. Carrera, I'm placing you under citizen's arrest pending investigation of your role in this conspiracy." The most powerful choice came from Luna herself, whose response to the mounting tension demonstrated an intelligence and emotional sophistication that transformed her from a passive victim into an active participant in her own salvation. As Dr. Carrera approached with what was clearly a sedative intended to incapacitate her for transport, Luna positioned herself protectively in front of Alexander, her body language shifting from fearful submission to determined defiance. She didn't growl or show aggression. Instead, she sat perfectly still and began the same deliberate howling pattern she had used to warn about the gas leak, but this time her calls were different, more complex, as if she were communicating something specific to everyone present. Dr. Martinez, her expertise in animal behavior helping her interpret Luna's actions, realized what the golden retriever was doing. "She's not just warning us," she said with amazement. "She's calling for help." That's a specific vocalization pattern that dogs use to summon their pack when they're in danger. As if responding to Luna's call, voices could be heard outside the chamber, not federal agents, but members of the press who had been following the story of the delayed execution and had arrived to investigate the unusual circumstances. Elizabeth Harper, recognizing the opportunity that Luna had created, made a choice that would have seemed impossible just hours before. "Let them in," she called toward the chamber entrance. "Let everyone see what they're trying to do to an innocent man and his dog." The decision to make their stand public was risky, but it also meant that any violence or misconduct would be witnessed by people who couldn't be silenced or intimidated. Alexander looked down at Luna with profound gratitude, understanding that his beloved companion wasn't just protecting him, she was teaching him that sometimes the only way to preserve love is to fight for it publicly, without shame or apology. "You're right, girl," he whispered, his voice gaining strength as he made his own final choice. "We don't hide anymore. We don't apologize for loving each other. We stand together and let the world see who we really are." Luna's tail wagged with approval, and her howling shifted to a different tone, still urgent, but now carrying a note of triumph that seemed to say the pack had been summoned and help was on the way. The choice to stand together became a moment of collective courage that would later be remembered as a turning point not just in Alexander's case but in the broader fight against institutional corruption, as each person in the chamber decided that some things were worth risking everything to protect. James Morrison, whose mother's death had originally brought him to witness Alexander's execution, stepped forward with a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. "My mother taught me that when you see injustice, you don't look away, you stand up," he said quietly. "I came here tonight wanting revenge, but what I found was the truth. And the truth is that this man and his dog are victims, not criminals." His words carried special weight because his pain had been so visible, and his transformation so complete, that even the federal marshals seemed affected by his testimony. Dr. Martinez made her own choice to risk her professional standing by refusing to allow Luna to be sedated or transported. "This dog is my patient," she declared with fierce protectiveness. "Any attempt to remove her from my care without proper medical justification will be reported to the State Veterinary Board as malpractice and to law enforcement as animal abuse." The cumulative effect of their resistance was creating doubt among the marshals, who were clearly beginning to question whether they were serving justice or participating in a cover-up. Sarah Chen, her phone still recording, made perhaps the most important choice of all by calling her contacts in investigative journalism. "This is Sarah Chen, lead prosecutor in the Rothschild case," she said clearly for the recording. "I am formally requesting immediate investigation into prosecutorial misconduct, federal conspiracy, and evidence tampering in this case. The defendant is innocent, and there has been a systematic effort to suppress evidence of his innocence and frame him for crimes committed by others." Her professional reputation was now on the line, but she had chosen truth over career security, and her willingness to sacrifice everything she had worked for gave moral authority to their resistance that couldn't be easily dismissed. Dr. Carrera, faced with unified opposition and the prospect of public exposure, began backing toward the chamber entrance, his authority crumbling as quickly as his conspiracy was being exposed. "This isn't over," he said with desperate menace. "You have no idea how deep this goes or how many people you're fighting." But Alexander, drawing strength from Luna's presence and the support of his unlikely family, made his final choice with a clarity that 18 months of self-doubt had never allowed. "We know exactly how deep it goes," he said quietly. "But love goes deeper. Truth goes deeper. And we're not afraid of you anymore." The culmination of their collective choice came when the chamber doors opened and a flood of witnesses entered, journalists, civil rights advocates, other families of pension fund victims who had been following the case, and even some of Alexander's former employees who had never believed the charges against him. Luna's howling had indeed summoned help, but more than that, it had summoned accountability. The sight that greeted the arriving witnesses was impossible to misinterpret: a man and his dog surrounded by protectors who had chosen love over law, truth over authority, and justice over institutional preservation. Elizabeth Harper, speaking to the gathering crowd with the moral authority of someone who had journeyed from hatred to understanding, told the story of their night: the gas leak that Luna had detected, the evidence of Alexander's innocence that had been suppressed, the conspiracy that had stolen not just money but the faith of everyone who believed in justice. "This man was going to die tonight for crimes he didn't commit," she said with passionate clarity. "This dog nearly died trying to save him and all of us. If we let them take him away now, if we let them silence the truth we've discovered, then we're all complicit in a system that destroys innocence to protect guilt." Margaret Harper stepped forward with Luna's medical records, documenting the dog's trauma and the cruelty of continued separation. Dr. Hoffman presented his psychological evaluation, revealing the systematic abuse Alexander had endured through false imprisonment. Captain Rodriguez displayed the surveillance photos that proved Alexander's innocence and revealed the conspiracy against him. Sarah Chen played her recordings of Dr. Carrera's attempts to obstruct justice and intimidate witnesses. The accumulation of evidence, testimony, and moral witness created a moment of truth that couldn't be suppressed or manipulated. Dr. Carrera and the federal marshals found themselves outnumbered not just by people but by the weight of exposed truth, their authority evaporating in the face of documented corruption and unified resistance. As Luna pressed against Alexander's side, her breathing strong and her tail wagging with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the salvation of one innocent man and his dog, but the power of ordinary people to choose extraordinary courage when love and truth were at stake. The choice had been made, the stand had been taken, and now the world would see what happened when corruption met the unstoppable force of unconditional love backed by unshakable determination to protect what mattered most. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Alexander Rothschild stood in the sunlit courtyard of the Rothschild Foundation for Animal Welfare and Criminal Justice Reform, watching Luna lead a group of children from the local children's hospital through their first therapy dog session, her golden coat gleaming in the afternoon light as she demonstrated the same intuitive healing abilities that had saved not just his life but the lives of everyone in that execution chamber. The foundation, built with the $47 billion that had been restored to him after the conspiracy's exposure, had become a beacon of hope for wrongfully convicted individuals and abandoned animals alike, but more than that, it had become a testament to the power of second chances and the wisdom that sometimes comes only through suffering. Luna, now certified as a therapy and detection dog, had become something of a celebrity, but she wore her fame with the same humble grace that had characterized her loyalty during Alexander's darkest hours. Dr. Martinez, who had become the Foundation's chief veterinary officer, watched Luna work with professional admiration and personal affection. "She remembers every person who stood up for her that night," she observed to Alexander as they watched Luna gently comfort a young boy who was struggling with the trauma of his own father's wrongful imprisonment. "Dogs don't forget kindness, and they don't forget courage." Alexander nodded, his eyes never leaving Luna as she seemed to instinctively understand exactly what each child needed: a gentle nuzzle for the shy ones, playful energy for those who had withdrawn into themselves, patient stillness for those who just needed to feel safe. "She's teaching them what she taught me," he said softly. "That love doesn't depend on perfect circumstances, that loyalty doesn't require logical reasons, and that sometimes the most broken souls are the ones most capable of healing others." The Foundation's work had expanded beyond what anyone had imagined possible, with Luna serving as both ambassador and inspiration for programs that paired rescue animals with individuals fighting wrongful convictions, creating bonds that provided emotional support during legal battles while giving abandoned animals the purpose and love they deserved. The emotional resolution that had begun in that execution chamber had continued to ripple outward in ways that none of them could have anticipated, transforming not just individual lives but the entire approach to justice and healing in their community. Elizabeth Harper, who had become the Foundation's Director of Victim Advocacy, found her life's purpose in helping families navigate the complex emotions that came with discovering their loved ones had been failed by the very system meant to protect them. "Grief doesn't disappear when you find out your anger was misdirected," she explained to a support group of families dealing with wrongful convictions. "But it can transform into something powerful, something that creates change instead of just creating more pain." Her relationship with Alexander had evolved into something that transcended their initial victim-perpetrator dynamic, becoming a friendship built on shared understanding of loss, redemption, and the courage required to rebuild trust in justice. Margaret Harper had left her private veterinary practice to establish the Foundation's animal therapy program, her expertise in animal behavior helping to create protocols that maximize the healing potential of human-animal bonds while ensuring the well-being of the therapy animals themselves. "Luna showed us that animals don't just provide comfort," she often told veterinary students who came to study their programs. "They provide truth. They respond to authenticity in ways that humans often can't, and that makes them perfect partners in healing trauma and exposing deception." Sarah Chen had made perhaps the most dramatic career change of all, leaving prosecution to become a defense attorney specializing in wrongful conviction cases, her intimate knowledge of how justice could be manipulated making her a formidable advocate for the innocent. "I spent 3 years building a case against Alexander based on lies," she would tell new clients. "Now I spend my time tearing down cases built the same way, and I promise you, I know exactly what to look for." Dr. Hoffman had written what was already being called the definitive study on institutional gaslighting and psychological manipulation in the criminal justice system, with Alexander and Luna's case serving as the central example of how love and loyalty could survive and ultimately triumph over systematic abuse. The most profound resolution came in the form of justice not just served but transformed, as the investigation that had begun with Luna's detection of the gas leak evolved into the largest corruption scandal in federal law enforcement history, ultimately leading to the exoneration of over 200 wrongfully convicted individuals and the exposure of a network of corporate government collaboration that had been manipulating the justice system for decades. Dr. Vincent Carrera and 17 other conspirators were now serving sentences in the same federal prison where Alexander had been held, their convictions based on the ironclad evidence that Luna had helped uncover and the testimony of victims who had found their voices through the Foundation's support programs. But Alexander took no satisfaction in their imprisonment, having learned through his own experience that true justice was about healing harm rather than inflicting punishment. "They destroyed lives because they forgot that every person they hurt was someone's Luna," he reflected during a television interview marking the first anniversary of his exoneration. "They lost sight of the fact that behind every case file is a family, behind every conviction is a community, and behind every wrongful accusation is a bond of love that doesn't disappear just because a court says it should." The interview was conducted in the Foundation's Memorial Garden, where a statue of Luna stood surrounded by plaques honoring the animals and humans who had suffered in the pursuit of justice. The real Luna, now 5 years old and in perfect health, had insisted on participating in the interview, positioning herself beside Alexander's chair with the same protective instincts that had guided her through their darkest hours. The interviewer, clearly moved by their bond, asked the question that everyone wanted. Answered, "What would you say to someone who's facing their own impossible situation, who feels like the system has abandoned them and there's no hope left?" Alexander's answer, delivered while gently stroking Luna's fur, became one of the most quoted statements in the history of criminal justice reform. "I would tell them to look for their Luna, that loyal voice, that unconditional love, that refuses to give up even when everything seems lost. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's an animal, sometimes it's just a belief in truth that won't die. But it's always there, and it's always worth fighting for." The sweetest resolution of all was the family that had formed from the ashes of that terrible night, a chosen clan bound not by blood but by shared trauma transformed into shared purpose, with Luna serving as the heart around which all their relationships revolved. The monthly gatherings at the foundation had become legendary, bringing together not just the original group from the execution chamber but the dozens of families they had helped, the hundreds of animals they had rescued, and the growing community of people who had learned that love was indeed stronger than hate, that truth was more powerful than lies, and that loyalty could survive even the cruelest attempts to destroy it. Elizabeth and Margaret Harper had become Alexander's closest friends and most trusted advisors, their shared experience creating a bond that transcended their different backgrounds and histories. James Morrison had joined the Foundation's board, his mother's memory honored through scholarships for families struggling with the financial costs of fighting wrongful convictions. Captain Rodriguez had become the Foundation's head of security and investigations, his expertise in detection work helping to develop new protocols for using animal intelligence in criminal justice reform. Dr. Martinez had revolutionized veterinary medicine's role in human healing, her work with Luna inspiring programs in hospitals and therapeutic facilities across the country. On this particular evening, as they gathered for their regular dinner in Alexander's restored penthouse, the same space where Luna had first tried to warn him about the conspiracy, the conversation was lighter than usual, filled with stories of recent successes and plans for future programs. Luna moved freely among the group, accepting scratches and treats from people who had once been strangers united only by their presence at what was supposed to be an execution, but who had become the most important family any of them had ever known. "Do you think she knows?" Elizabeth asked, watching Luna settle contentedly between Alexander's chair and her own. "Do you think she understands what she accomplished that night?" Alexander's smile carried the peace of someone who had learned to trust in love even when logic suggested despair. "I think she knows exactly what she accomplished," he said softly. "She saved all of us from becoming the kind of people who could watch injustice happen and do nothing to stop it. She reminded us that love doesn't give up, loyalty doesn't quit, and truth doesn't stay buried forever." The final resolution came not with dramatic endings but with quiet beginnings, as Luna's legacy continued to ripple outward through every life she touched, every program she inspired, and every moment of love that chose courage over fear. On the second anniversary of the night that changed everything, the Pennsylvania State Penitentiary's execution chamber was formally converted into a meditation and healing space for families of crime victims, with a bronze plaque reading, "In honor of Luna, who taught us that the highest form of justice is the transformation of pain into compassion." Alexander and Luna attended the dedication ceremony, where they were joined by the hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by their story. The governor, in his dedication speech, spoke words that captured what everyone present understood to be true. This space once represented the end of hope, the final answer to irreversible pain. Today it represents something different, the beginning of healing, the first step toward justice that repairs instead of simply punishing, and the proof that love really can transform even the darkest places into sources of light. As the ceremony concluded and people began to leave, Alexander and Luna remained for a few minutes in the space where their real life together had truly begun. Luna, now mature and confident but still playful, explored the transformed chamber with curious interest, her tail wagging as she investigated the meditation cushions and healing crystals that had replaced the execution equipment. "We did it, girl," Alexander whispered, kneeling to wrap his arms around her neck. "We not only survived, we helped other people survive too." Luna's response was the same as it had always been. She pressed her face against his chest, her breathing calm and steady, her presence a reminder that some bonds are too strong to be broken by anything the world can throw at them. As they walked out of the building together into the warm afternoon sunlight, Luna's steps were confident and sure, her head held high with the dignity of a dog who had spent her life serving love and had been rewarded with a purpose that would outlive them both. Alexander looked back once at the building that had almost claimed his life, then forward toward the car where Elizabeth, Margaret, and Sarah were waiting to drive them home to the foundation, to their work, to their chosen family, and to the hundreds of animals and humans who were alive and free because a golden retriever named Luna had refused to let love lose to fear, loyalty lose to law, or truth lose to the temporary power of lies. The last image burned into everyone's memory was of Luna settling contentedly into the back seat between Alexander and Elizabeth, her eyes bright with intelligence and satisfaction, her tail wagging with the slow, steady rhythm of a job well done and a love that had transformed the world simply by refusing to give up. And in that moment, everyone who had been part of their story understood the most important truth of all, that greatest revolutions begin not with violence or protest, but with the quiet insistence of unconditional love that says, simply and powerfully, "This is wrong, and I will not stop fighting until it's made right." Tell us in the comments, what do you think would have happened if Luna hadn't been there that night? Do you believe animals can sense things about people that humans miss?